The mountain didn't care that Walter Greer was dying. It didn't care about the oxygen tank sitting beside him, or the 3 prescription bottles rattling in his jacket pocket, or the medical file back in his truck that used to say 6 months and had recently been quietly revised to 4. The mountain just sat there in the cold dark, the way it always had, indifferent and permanent and enormous, and Walt had always respected that about it. He was pressing both palms flat against the egg when it cracked. Not a dramatic crack. Not the kind you see in movies where the whole shell explodes outward in a shower of light. Just a single thin line running diagonal from the top curve down toward the base, like a fault line deciding it had waited long enough. Walt felt it before he heard it. A faint vibration moving to the shell and into his hands, almost like a pulse. He didn't move. He didn't call anyone. He just looked at that crack in the dark and said, quietly, to no one at all, "I'm not going anywhere, so you might as well hatch." 3 weeks earlier, Walter Greer had been cleaning out his dead wife's garden. Eleanor had been gone 14 months. The garden had kept growing anyway, the way things do when they don't know they're supposed to stop. Walt had been avoiding it since the funeral, walking around it, keeping his eyes forward whenever he passed the kitchen window. But that Tuesday morning, he'd gone out with a pair of gloves and a trash bag and just started pulling, not because he was ready, because the alternative was standing still, and standing still had started to feel dangerous. He was on his knees in the dirt when Marcus called. His son's voice had that careful, measured quality Walt had come to recognize, the tone Marcus used when he was saying one thing and meaning another. He asked how Walt was feeling. Walt said fine. Marcus asked if Walt had looked at the transfer paperwork yet, the documents that would shift the deed on the mountain cabin to Marcus's name, so it could be folded into the land assessment for the resource project his company was running near the border territories. Walt said he hadn't gotten around to it. There was a pause. Then Marcus said he'd send another copy, and they could talk soon and to take care of himself. Walt hung up and looked at the garden for a long time. The cabin had been Eleanor's idea, 38 years ago. A weekend place, she'd said, somewhere quiet. They'd ended up spending more time there than anywhere else. It sat at the edge of the neutral zone, the buffer strip of land between human settlements and the Veil Fairy Dragon territories, enforced by treaty and maintained by the kind of mutual distrust that occasionally passed for peace. Walt had spent 4 decades learning the rhythms of that mountain. He knew which trails the border scouts used. He knew the smell of a Veil Fairy scent marker, that particular mixture of sulfur and something older, something that had no human equivalent, because Eleanor had cataloged it years ago in the field journal she'd filled during her time as a xenobiologist. He drove to the cabin that afternoon to say goodbye to it. He found the egg the next morning. He'd taken the North Ridge Trail out of habit, the one he'd walked so many times his boots knew it better than his eyes did. The egg was half buried under a collapse of loose shale, still faintly warm against the cold air, large as an engine block and mottled gray-brown with streaks of deep amber running through the shell. Beside it, half covered in debris, was a broken piece of shell from what had clearly been a second egg, one that hadn't made it. And there was the scent. Walt crouched down slowly, one hand on his knee, and breathed it in. Sulfur, and that other thing, the marker. He'd read enough of Eleanor's notes to know exactly what it meant. A Veil Fairy clutch mother had been here. She had performed the abandonment rite, left a marker, departed, released her claim. In dragon law, this egg was already dead. A hatchling that received the abandonment rite would die inside its shell within hours if no living presence remained close enough for it to register. Walt checked his watch, looked at the egg, looked at the trail back to the cabin. He sat down on the cold ground beside it. He wasn't sure why, exactly. He wasn't a sentimental man, or at least he'd never thought himself as one. He just thought, something's trying to be born, and I've got time. That was all. That was the whole reason. A dying man with nowhere urgent to be, sitting down next to a living thing that needed someone to stay. And 3 weeks later, at 2 a.m, with his oxygen tank beside him and the mountain cold pressing in from every direction, he felt the egg crack under his hands, and he didn't move an inch. The hatchling didn't explode out of the shell. She worked her way out slowly, methodically, like she understood that the world on the other side required effort and intended to meet it properly. First one small foreleg, dark-scaled and trembling, pushing through the crack Walt had felt in the dark. Then the shell split further, not dramatically, but with a kind of quiet inevitability. And she emerged piece by piece into the cold mountain air, blinking against even the faint starlight, like it was something she needed to negotiate with before accepting. Walt didn't speak. He just watched. She was small. That was the first thing that struck him, and it struck him hard. He'd seen veil fairy hatchlings twice before in his life. Once at a distance, once up close when a juvenile had wandered past the cabin's treeline, and Eleanor had nearly knocked over a coffee grabbing for her camera. They were substantial creatures, even newborn. The size of large dogs at minimum, all coiled muscle and territorial instinct. This one was barely larger than a house cat. Her wings were tucked flat against her back, thin as paper, threaded with fine amber veins that caught the starlight and held it. Her scales were a deep charcoal gray, almost black, with that same amber undertone running through them like a current. She finished emerging and sat in the broken shell and looked at Walt. Her eyes were silver, not gray, silver, the way old mirrors are silver, with depth behind the surface. Walt had never read anything in Eleanor's notes about silver eyes. He filed that away without knowing why. They looked at each other for a long moment, the old man and a hatchling, breathing the same cold air on the same dark mountain. Then she made a sound, not a roar, not a cry, something quieter than both, and moved toward him in an unsteady, determined line, and pressed the top of her head against his hand the way a dog does when it's decided a question of belonging is settled. Walt exhaled slowly. "All right," he said. "All right then." He didn't understand, not yet, what that moment meant in veil theory law. He didn't know the word for what had just happened. Imprinting, the permanent, irreversible registration of a first presence, the bonding that dragon culture considered more binding than birth family, more sacred than clutch loyalty. He didn't know that in 3,000 years of cautious, fragile coexistence between humans and veil fairy, it had never happened between the two species. Not once. Not documented anywhere in any treaty archive or diplomatic record or xenobiological field journal, including Eleanor's. He just knew she was cold, and he was cold, and the cabin was 20 minutes down the trail. He named her Ember on the walk back, mostly because he needed to call her something, and it seemed to fit. The amber running through her scales, the warmth she'd been holding in that egg against all odds. She rode inside his jacket for the first 10 minutes, then apparently decided she preferred to walk and dropped the trail beside him, matching his pace with a focused, slightly indignant energy, as if she'd been walking mountain trails her entire life, which was technically less than an hour. Walt made her a space near the fireplace. She ignored it and positioned herself at the foot of his bed. He decided not to argue. He woke at dawn to find the room warmer than the wood stove could count for. Not uncomfortably warm. Precisely warm, the specific temperature a body wants when it's been sleeping in mountain cold and hasn't quite shaken it. He lay still for a moment, trying to understand the source of it. Ember was awake at the foot of the bed, eyes open, watching him with that silver focus that already felt less like an animal's attention and more like something that was taking notes. He noticed it on the third morning. The cold came in hard overnight, early season, sharp and sudden, and he woke to find frost on the inside of the window, but none of the bone-deep chill he'd expected. He was warm, more than warm. He looked at Ember, and she looked back, and he thought, slowly and carefully, she's doing something. He started paying attention after that. Over the following 2 weeks, Walt watched Ember the way Eleanor used to watch things, quietly, from a slight distance, without projecting. What he observed didn't fit anything he'd read. She produced no fire, not even a spark. He'd half expected it, knowing she'd been abandoned. But it wasn't the absence of fire that interested him. It was what she did instead. She seemed to draw warmth out of surrounding air, pulling it from the room, from the ground, from a mountain wind, and then release it again in controlled, steady pulses. Not randomly, deliberately. She kept the cabin at exactly the temperature Walt's lungs needed. On the hardest breathing nights, when the altitude and the cancer combined into something he just had to get through, the air around was always exactly right. He didn't tell Marcus any of this when his son called. Marcus had questions about the paperwork. Walt redirected to the weather. Marcus asked if Walt was eating properly. Walt said yes. There was a pause that had become familiar, The pause where Marcus was deciding whether to say the thing he actually meant. And then Marcus said he was thinking of coming up to the cabin for a few days, just to check in. Walt said that would be fine. He looked across the room at Ember, who had climbed onto Eleanor's reading chair and was methodically examining the field journal stacked on the side table, pressing one small foreleg against each spine in turn. "We're going to have company," Walt told her. She looked up, tilted her head exactly once, then went back to the journals. Walt had the distinct impression she'd already known. Marcus Greer drove up the mountain with a casserole dish his assistant had prepared and a speech he'd been rehearsing since the highway turnoff. He'd planned it carefully, the way Marcus planned most things. He would be calm. He would be practical. He would point out, gently but clearly, that his father was 71 years old with stage 3 lung cancer and a supplemental oxygen tank, and absolutely no business living alone at elevation in a cabin that was about to legally transfer to Marcus's company's land portfolio anyway. He would suggest the assisted living facility in Bozeman that his father's doctor had recommended. He would not raise his voice. He would be the reasonable one, because someone in this family had to be. He got out of the truck, walked up the porch steps, opened the cabin door, and found a dragon the size of a large house cat sitting in his mother's reading chair, staring at him with silver eyes. Marcus stood in the doorway for a very long moment. "Dad," he said, "she won't bite." Walt said from the kitchen, without turning around, "Probably." The speech lasted approximately 4 minutes before it collapsed entirely under the weight of reality. Marcus sat at the kitchen table with untouched coffee in front of him while Walt explained. In the unhurried way he explained most things. What happened on the ridge trail, the egg, the abandonment marker, the hatch, the imprinting. Marcus asked 3 times if Walt understood what a veil theory was. Walt pointed out that he'd been living 40 yards from the treaty boundary for 38 years and had been married to a woman who wrote her doctoral thesis on veil theory clutch behavior. So, yes, he was broadly familiar. Ember watched the entire conversation from the reading chair with the focused, unblinking attention of someone auditing a meeting. "Dad, they will come for her." "I expect so." "And you're, what?" "Going to tell them no." Walt poured himself coffee. "I'm going to deal with that when it happens." Marcus pressed both hands flat on the table, a gesture Walt recognized. Eleanor had done the same thing when she was containing frustration. "You have 4 months, Marcus said quietly. "The doctor said 4 months. You shouldn't be up here alone. You shouldn't be up here at all. And you definitely shouldn't be up here with," he gestured toward a reading chair, "whatever this is." Walt looked at his son for a moment. Then he said, "She keeps the room at the right temperature. Easier on the lungs." Marcus opened his mouth, closed it, looked at Ember. Ember looked back at him with an expression that Marcus would later describe to no one as unsettling patience. Marcus stayed 3 days longer than he'd planned. He told himself it was to assess the situation. That was partially true. The other part, the part he didn't examine closely, was that his father seemed more alive than he had at the funeral, or at Christmas, or at any point in the 14 months since his mother had died, and Marcus didn't know what to do with that. On the second day, he found Ember on the porch watching him replace a rotted board near the steps. He'd brought the right tools, cut the lumber to length, was fitting the new board into place. And when he turned back from the toolbox, she had repositioned 3 of the surrounding boards he hadn't touched yet, nudging them with her forelegs into a slightly different alignment. He stared at them. He stared at her. He got down and looked at the understructure of the porch and realized, slowly, that her arrangement would distribute the weight more evenly across the aging joists. It was a structurally superior configuration. He had a civil engineering degree, and he had missed it. She'd been alive for 2 weeks. He didn't mention it to Walt. He wasn't sure what he would have said. What happened on the 4th morning changed everything, though none of them knew it yet. Walt had been sleeping later, the altitude and the medication conspiring against his mornings, and Marcus was up early, drinking coffee on the porch when he heard movement in the tree line. Not animal movement. Something deliberate, measured, and large. He was standing before he'd made a conscious decision to stand. The figure that emerged from the trees was veil theory, but not like any veil theory Marcus had seen in the occasional distant glimpses near the treaty boundary. This one was smaller than the border soldiers, moving without their rigid formation, dressed in what Marcus would later learn were diplomatic traveling clothes rather than warden livery. She stepped into the clearing in front of the cabin and stopped and looked at Marcus with amber eyes that were very old and very tired and very careful. She said in perfect English with an accent that sounded like wind through mountain rock, "I need to speak with the human who holds a bond. Is he here?" Marcus said, "Just a moment," and went inside and woke his father with considerably more urgency than he'd intended. Walt came out onto the porch with his oxygen tank and his coffee and looked at the Veil Theory diplomat standing in his clearing. Ember appeared aside from nowhere, pressed against his leg, and looked at the visitor with those silver eyes that missed nothing. The diplomat looked at Ember for a long moment. Something moved across her face, not quite recognition, not quite fear, something older than both. She looked back at Walt. "My name is Dara," she said, "counselor to High Warden Soreth. I serve the Veil Theory Northern Range Authority." She paused. "I am not here officially." Walt said, "Then sit down. I'll get another cup." Dara told him what was coming. She told him about Soreth's reclamation order, authorized 3 days after the hatching signature was detected, a formal Veil Theory military action that would send 6 soldiers and a warden deputy to retrieve the abandoned hatchling and dissolve a legal bond by separating the parties before it fully calcified under Veil Theory law. She explained a timeline with the clipped precision of someone who had memorized facts they didn't fully agree with. She told them they had 1 week. Then she stopped, and in the silence after the facts, Marcus watched her look at Ember again, that same complicated expression, and he thought, she didn't come here just to warn them. She came here because something about this is wrong, and she knows it, and she can't say it out loud yet. "Why are you telling us this?" Marcus asked. Dara was quiet for a moment. "Because I have served Soreth for 60 years, she said finally, "and I have never once questioned an order." She looked at her hands. "I am questioning this one." She left without explaining further. They watched her disappear back into the tree line, and then stood in the clearing in the cold morning air, the 3 of them, Walt, Marcus, and Ember, and nobody spoke for a long time. Then Marcus said, very quietly, "I need to make some calls." Walt said, "Before you do that, I need to show you something your mother wrote." He went inside and came back with Eleanor's oldest field journal. He sat on the porch railing and opened it to a page marked with a strip of faded ribbon, the kind Eleanor used as bookmarks because she said dog ears were a moral failing. The entry was dated 19 years ago. The handwriting was careful and small and unmistakably hers. Marcus read it once. Then he read it again. Then he looked at Ember, standing quietly at Walt's side, silver eyes on the tree line where Dara had vanished, and he felt the specific chill of understanding something that changed the shape of everything that had come before it. "Dad," he said slowly, "she wasn't abandoned because she was weak." Walt closed the journal. "No," he said, "she wasn't." The mountain was very quiet around them. Somewhere in the tree line, a branch shifted. Ember didn't move. She was still watching the place where Dara had gone, with a patient, absolute focus of something that had been listening to every word since the moment was born, and had understood far more than anyone realized. Walter Greer had neat handwriting. Walt had always loved that about her. The way her letters sat evenly on the page, unhurried, each word given its proper space. Even in the field, crouched in mountain wind with a notebook balanced on her knee, her writing looked like she'd been sitting at a proper desk with good light and no distractions. Marcus used to tease her about it when he was young. She'd told him that sloppy thinking produced sloppy writing, and she intended to do neither. Standing on the cabin porch with his mother's journal open in front of him, Marcus wasn't teasing anyone. The entry was 19 years old. Eleanor had written it after a 3-day research trip into the neutral zone with a Veil Theory scholar she'd corresponded with for years. One of the few formal academic exchanges that the Dragon Council had permitted during that period. The scholar's name was recorded only by its Veil Theory approximation, something Eleanor had transliterated as Vaindrath. The subject of their exchange, according to the journal, had begun as standard clutch behavior documentation and had shifted, on the second evening, into something the scholar had clearly been wanting to discuss for a long time. Marcus read the relevant section twice, then read it a third time to make sure he was reading it correctly. Eleanor had written, VD confirms the old classification exists in their biological records, though it has been formally suppressed in council documentation for approximately 2 centuries. He calls them Veilthrin, thermal anchors, in the closest English translation, born without fire production capability, but with inverse thermal sensitivity that allows absorption and redistribution of environmental heat across a significant radius. He says the range in a mature specimen could cover several square miles. Ancient veil theory texts considered them sacred, stabilizing presences, creatures that could regulate the thermal environment of an entire territory. The modern council classified them differently. VD would not say the word they use now. He said only, they are afraid of what a Veilthrin becomes when it is fully bonded. I asked what it becomes. He looked at me for a long time and then said, something that cannot be controlled by fire. Marcus closed the journal carefully. He looked at Ember. She was sitting very still at Walt's side, silver eyes moving between Marcus and the journal with an attention that was no longer surprising and had not been for several days. Marcus thought about the porch boards. He thought about the way she tracked conversations, the slight tilt of her head when a new word appeared that she was filing away. He thought about what cannot be controlled by fire meant when applied to a species whose entire power structure, military capability, and social hierarchy were built on production of flame. She can absorb it, Marcus said. Not a question. That's what your mother believed. Walt said. Soreth knew. Had to. Walt took a slow breath through the oxygen line. A clutch mother doesn't perform the abandonment rite on a living egg without a warden's authorization. That's treaty law on their side, documented. The rite requires sign-off from the regional authority. Soreth authorized it personally. Marcus set the journal on the porch railing. He was quiet for a moment, working through the geometry of it. He didn't abandon her because she was weak, he said slowly. He abandoned her because she was the one thing his soldiers couldn't fight, and because a Veilthrin bonded to a human. Walt said, sitting in the middle of the neutral zone is something no existing treaty has ever had to account for. The silence that followed had weight to it. Marcus picked up his coffee, found it cold, set it back down. He looked out at the tree line where Dara had disappeared and thought about the way the counselor had looked at Ember, that expression he cataloged but not yet fully understood. Not fear exactly, something more like the feeling you get when you realize a problem you thought was contained has been growing in a direction you weren't watching. Then Marcus's phone rang. He looked at the screen. His operations manager, calling from the extraction site. He almost let it go to voicemail, and then some instinct made him answer. The conversation lasted 6 minutes. When it ended, Marcus stood with the phone at his side and looked at the mountain with an expression Walt recognized from 30 years earlier, from a moment when Marcus was 14 and had broken the cabin's rear window with a baseball and stood exactly like that in the yard. The expression of someone doing rapid calculations on consequences they had not previously considered. The drilling, Marcus said. Walt waited. We've been getting anomalous thermal readings from the geothermal layer for the past 3 weeks. My team flagged it as equipment variance. Marcus paused. It's not equipment variance. The drill pattern is hitting a thermal vent network that runs northeast under the mountain. The vibration modeling we just ran. If we continue at the current rate and depth, the fracture propagation reaches a primary vent junction in approximately 25 to 30 days, Walt said quietly. Marcus stared at him. How did you? Walt nodded toward Ember. Marcus turned slowly to look at her. She was sitting precisely where she'd been, watching both of them, and something in her posture, the angle of her head, the placement of her forelegs. Marcus had a sudden, vertiginous understanding of what he was looking at. She hadn't just been keeping the cabin warm. She'd been mapping every pulse of thermal redistribution, every calibration of the room's temperature. She'd been reading the mountain underneath them, feeling it through geology the way a doctor reads a pulse. She knows where it is, Marcus said. I think she's known for a while, Walt said. The vent junction, if it fractures, the northern range thermal network collapses, Walt said. Winter nest temperatures drop below survivable levels. Eleanor wrote about this too. There's a whole section on veil theory thermal dependency during egg incubation season. He paused. Hundreds of eggs, Marcus. A generation. Marcus sat down on the porch steps. He sat there for a long moment with his elbows on his knees, looking at the ground, and Walt let him sit because some information needed a minute to find its proper place. The picture that had been assembling itself piece by piece was now complete, and it was considerably larger and more complicated than any of them had understood a week ago. Sortha's aggression wasn't purely about Ember. It wasn't purely about a human violating the abandonment right or an illegal bond disrupting veil theory law. It was about the mountain. It was about Marcus's drilling operation threatening the northern range's survival, while Sorth lacked the legal mechanism to stop it, because a treaty that governed the neutral zone didn't give the veil theory authority over human commercial operations outside the boundary line. And a manufactured confrontation over a bonded hatchling gave Sorth exactly the legal trigger he needed, a human violation of veil theory's sacred law that could void the existing treaty and allow the Dragon Council to reclaim the full mountain range under emergency territorial authority. Walt's small act of stubbornness on a dark ridge trail had walked directly into the center of a crisis that had been building for years. He was going to use us, Marcus said finally, the confrontation, the reclamation order. He was going to use it to pull the treaty. To save the mountain, Walt said. His way. Marcus looked up. There's another way. Walt said nothing. He was watching Ember, who had stood up from her position at his side and walked to the edge of the porch and was looking northeast toward the mountain's interior with an expression, if you could call it that, of absolute, unmoving focus. Like she was listening to something underground, like she was reading the pulse of the geology below and had been for days, quietly, patiently, and had been waiting for the humans around her to catch up to what she already knew. Marcus followed his father's gaze. She knows exactly where the fracture point is, he said slowly. I believe she does, Walt said, and if we could prove it, the vent network, the drill impact, the timeline, we could shut the site down voluntarily. Before Sorth has a trigger, before the treaty confrontation, before any of this becomes a war. Walt nodded once. I'll need 3 days, Marcus said. The geological data, the drill records, the thermal modeling. I can build a case. I know the right engineers. He paused. But Dad, that still leaves Sorth. It still leaves a reclamation order. 6 soldiers and a deputy warden, and he checked his watch. 5 days now. I know, Walt said. What are you going to do about that? Walt picked up Eleanor's journal from the porch railing. He turned it over in his hands, feeling the worn cover, the familiar weight of it. 19 years of margin notes and field observations, and questions Eleanor had been building toward an answer she hadn't lived to give. I'm going to finish what your mother started, he said. He went inside. Ember followed him without being asked, her small claws quiet on the porch boards. Marcus sat alone on the steps in the cold morning air, listening to the mountain. And for the first time since he'd driven up with a casserole and a rehearsed speech, he wasn't thinking about paperwork. He was thinking about a 14-year-old boy who had stood in a yard dreading his father's disappointment and found instead a man who picked up a piece of wood and showed him how to replace a broken window frame and never once mentioned the broken glass. He pulled out his phone and called his operations manager back. Shut down the drilling, he said. All of it, right now. A pause on the other end. Sir, the quarterly projections. I know what the projections say, Marcus said. Shut it down. He hung up, looked at the mountain. Somewhere beneath it, a thermal vent network was still intact, still functioning, still keeping a generation of dragon eggs at exactly the temperature they needed to survive. He thought about Ember, keeping a dying old man's lungs working through cold mountain nights. He thought, she learned that from him, you said. Right part 5. The soldiers came on a Tuesday. Walt had known they would come in the morning. Veil theory military protocol, according to Eleanor's notes, favored dawn approaches for reclamation actions, the logic being that most creatures were slower and less decisive in the first hour of light. He'd been awake since 4. He'd made coffee, taken his medication, sat with Eleanor's journal open on the kitchen table, and read the same passage 11 times until he didn't need to read it anymore. Marcus had worked for 3 days without sleeping properly. The geological report was 47 pages. Walt had read every one of them, made notes in the margins, and then spent 2 evenings building a secondary document, shorter, cleaner, Structured the way he used to structure engineering assessments when he was 40 and sharp and presented to clients who needed to understand a problem before they could authorize a solution. He'd been a structural engineer for 31 years. He understood load bearing. He understood the difference between a structure that looked stable and one that actually was. He understood how to explain, clearly and without sentiment, exactly where something was going to break and when. Ember had slept at the foot of his bed and kept the room at exactly the right temperature, and Walt had lain awake in the warmth she made and thought about Eleanor, the way he did most nights, but differently than before. Less like loss, more like conversation, like she was still in the middle of a sentence and he was waiting to hear the rest of it. At 6:47 in the morning, Ember stood up from the footbed and walked to the window and looked northeast. Walt got up, got dressed, picked up his oxygen tank, and went to the porch. They came out of the tree line 6 minutes later. 6 soldiers, as Dara had said, full warden livery, dark-scaled armor that caught the early light and threw it back in amber fragments, the formal insignia of the Northern Range Authority on each chest plate. They moved in a precise 2-column formation, unhurried, the way institutions move when they are certain of their authority. Behind them, at a distance that was itself a statement of rank, came the deputy warden, taller than the soldiers, older, carrying the formal reclamation staff that indicated this was an official Veil Theory legal action rather than a military engagement. And behind the deputy warden, on the ridge above the tree line, a figure that had not been in Dara's briefing, High Warden Soreth. Walt had seen photographs. Eleanor had kept a file on the Northern Range leadership, but photographs hadn't conveyed the scale of him. He was old in the way mountains are old, the age written into the density of him rather than any visible decay. His scales were deep charcoal, nearly black, faded at the edges to gray of old iron. He stood on the ridge and looked down at the cabin clearing with the patient, absolute authority of something that had been making decisions about this mountain for 3 centuries and intended to continue doing so. He was not supposed to be here personally. That told Walt something important. Marcus came out of the cabin and stood beside his father. He was carrying a leather document folder, the geological report, the thermal modeling, the drill records, all of it organized with the methodical precision of a man who had spent 3 days making sure nothing could be questioned. He looked at the soldiers crossing the clearing and then up at Soreth on the ridge and said, very quietly, he came himself. He's worried, Walt said. About Ember? About what Ember represents. Walt watched the deputy warden approach. There's a difference. Ember was at Walt's side. She hadn't pressed against his leg the way she sometimes did in uncertain moments. She was standing slightly apart from him, on his left, and she was very still, and her silver eyes were on Soreth rather than the soldiers. She had the focused, measuring quality of something that was making its own assessment and had been for some time. The deputy warden stopped 8 feet from the porch steps. He was professional and correct and delivered the formal reclamation declaration in Veil Theory legal language, and then, courteously, in English, he cited the abandonment right. He cited the illegal bond formation. He cited the specific treaty clause that, in the Veil Theory interpretation, gave the Northern Range Authority jurisdiction over any Veil Theory hatchling regardless of location or circumstance. He was thorough. He was not unkind. He was simply certain. When he finished, Walt said, I'd like to respond to that. The deputy warden inclined his head. Walt didn't raise his voice. He never had been a man who raised his voice. Eleanor used to say that was how you knew when he was serious, because the quieter Walt got, the more load-bearing every word became. He spoke the way he used to present engineering assessments, clearly, in sequence, without decoration. He began with Eleanor's journal. He didn't read from it. He knew the relevant passages well enough by then to speak them directly, citing page and date and the name of the Veil Theory scholar who confirmed the Veil Theory classification to Eleanor 19 years ago. He described the biological profile, the thermal absorption capability, the ancient classification, the modern suppression. He cited the specific Veil Theory legal record that Eleanor had documented, the formal council reclassification of Veil Theory hatchlings that occurred 211 years ago, the vote tally, the stated rationale, and the one dissenting council member who had filed minority opinion that Eleanor had translated and recorded in full. He paused. Let that sit. Then he said, Under the abandonment right as codified in the Northern Range Authority Charter, a warden may authorize abandonment of a hatchling only under specific enumerated conditions. Biological deficiency is one. Territorial resource limitation is another. He looked up at Soreth on the ridge. Classified threat designation is not on that list. It has never been on that list. The right was applied to this hatchling under a false biological deficiency claim, when the actual reason for abandonment was a threat classification that your own charter does not permit as grounds for the right. The clearing was very quiet, which means, Walt continued, the abandonment was not lawfully performed, which means the hatchling was not lawfully abandoned, which means a bond that formed is not an illegal bond under veil theory law, because there was nothing to be abandoned in the first place. The deputy warden had gone very still. Marcus stepped forward and held out the document folder. There's a second matter, he said. His voice was steady. Walt had not told him to be steady. He just was, the same way he'd been steady on the phone 3 days ago when he'd shut down a multi-million-dollar operation with 9 words. My company's drilling operation in the geothermal layer beneath this mountain has been creating fracture propagation in the primary thermal vent network serving the northern range. We have the data. We have the timeline. The vent junction reaches critical fracture threshold in approximately 18 days at previous drilling rates. He opened the folder and held it toward the deputy warden. The drilling has already been stopped, voluntarily, 3 days ago. Marcus kept his voice even. The geological data shows the fracture propagation will stabilize without further intervention if no additional drilling occurs within the affected radius. The Northern Range winter nesting network will remain intact. A pause. I've also filed a formal withdrawal of the land transfer application that would have extended our operation further into the neutral zone. That filing was submitted yesterday. The deputy warden looked at the documents. He looked at them for a long time. What are you asking? He said finally. I'm not asking for anything, Walt said. I'm presenting facts. What you do with them is your business. Then Ember moved. She stepped forward from Walt's left side, not toward the soldiers, not toward the deputy warden, but toward the center of the clearing. And she stopped there and stood in the open space between the porch and the soldiers, and she was very small and very still, and the early morning light caught the amber in her scales and held it. She looked up at Soreth on the ridge, just looked at him. Silver eyes, direct and unblinking, across the distance between them, and then slowly, deliberately, she exhaled. Not fire, the opposite of fire. The temperature in the clearing dropped 15 degrees in 8 seconds. Walt felt it, a clean, sharp cold, precise as a blade, radiating outward from Ember in a perfect circle. Frost formed on the grass at the soldiers' feet. Their breath became visible. The clearing was suddenly, absolutely winter, generated from a single small creature standing alone in the open ground. The soldiers stopped moving, all 6 of them, in unison without a command, because they recognized it. They knew what it was. In the oldest veil theory stories, the ones that predate the modern council by 1,000 years, the veil throwing were described exactly this way, not as weapons, as proof, a demonstration of something so specific it could not be faked, could not be mistaken, and could not be argued with. Then Ember stopped. The temperature returned to normal in seconds, controlled, precise, no lingering effect. She walked back to Walt's side and pressed against his leg, and looked up at him with those silver eyes, calm as a mountain lake in no wind. Soreth descended from the ridge. He came down slowly, the soldiers parting for him without a word, and he crossed the clearing and stopped in front of Walt and looked at him for a long moment without speaking. Up close, he was even more substantial, that deep, worn authority that 3 centuries produce in a creature built to carry it. His amber eyes moved from Walt to Ember to Marcus to the document folder and back to Walt. Walt looked back at him without blinking. You are a dying man, Soreth said. His English was perfect and very old-fashioned, each word chosen with the care of someone who learned the language from documents rather than conversation. I am, Walt agreed. You came to this mountain to say goodbye to it. That was the original plan. Soreth was quiet for a moment. Why did you stay? Walt considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. Something was trying to be born, he said. And I had time. The High Warden looked at him for a long time. Then he looked at Ember, and this time the expression on his ancient face was not the cold calculation Dara had described, not the political assessment of a threat to be managed. It was something older than politics, something that had been buried under 200 years of institutional fear, and was surfacing now, slowly, in the presence of a silver-eyed hatchling standing quietly beside a dying old man on a mountain morning. It looked, Walt thought, almost like recognition. Sora said nothing for a long time. That was the thing Walt noticed most. Not the size of him, not the weight of authority he carried like geology carries stone, but the silence. 300 years of decisions and declarations, and the High Warden stood in a cabin clearing on a Tuesday morning and said nothing, and the soldiers didn't move, and the mountain didn't move, and even the wind seemed to understand that something was being worked out that required room. Dara appeared from the tree line. She came without announcement, without the formal approach the soldiers had used, just stepped out of the trees the way she had that first morning, and crossed the clearing, and took a position to sort to his left of the practiced placement of someone who had stood beside this particular figure for 60 years and knew exactly where she belonged. She looked at Walt. Something in her expression was different from the warning visit, less careful, more direct, the look of someone who had made a decision and was no longer negotiating with themselves about it. Sora glanced at her, a long look, the kind that carried 60 years of shared history in its duration. Then he looked back at Walt. "You studied the old law," Sora said. It was not quite an accusation, and not quite a compliment. "My wife studied it," Walt said. "I read her notes." She was a xenobiologist, Walter Greer. Walt didn't let the surprise show on his face, though he felt it. "You knew her work." The council reviewed all academic documentation of veil theory biology produced by human researchers. Sora said hers was the most accurate. A pause. "We considered approaching her. About the veil-thrin record specifically. There were things in her documentation that suggested she was close to conclusions that would have been inconvenient. But you didn't approach her," Walt said. "She died," Sora said. "Simply, not cruelly. Just the fact placed between them." Walt absorbed that. The implication of it. That Eleanor had been closer to the truth than even her journal suggested. Close enough that the Dragon Council had noticed. Settled into him the way cold settles into old bones. Not painfully, just permanently. So instead, Walt said, you made sure the next veil-thrin never bonded with anyone. Sora was quiet for a moment. "I made a decision I believed was necessary for preservation of my people's stability." "You abandoned a child," Walt said. The words were quiet, and they were not angry, and they landed harder for both of those things. "You authorized abandoning a living hatchling on a mountain because you were afraid of what she might become. I've known human beings who made the same choice." He didn't look at Marcus when he said it, but he felt his son go still beside him. It never produces what they're hoping for. Soreth looked at him. The amber eyes were unreadable in a way that very old things are sometimes unreadable. Not because there's nothing there, but because there's too much, layered too deep, and the surface has learned to be still. "What does it produce?" Soreth asked. "This," Walt said. "Exactly this. The thing you were trying to prevent. Standing in front of you anyway, having gotten here without your help." Dara made a sound, not quite a word, not quite a laugh, something between, quickly suppressed. Soreth glanced at her again. This time the long look had something different in it. Something that might, in a human face, have been the particular exhaustion of someone who has just heard the thing they already knew stated plainly by someone with no reason to be diplomatic about it. He looked down at Ember. She looked back up at him. Patient, silver-eyed, exactly herself. "She is smaller than any veil-thrin in the historical record," Soreth said, and for the first time his voice had something in it that wasn't authority. Something quieter. The ancient text described them as apex thermal presences, stabilizing forces across entire ranges. He paused. "She is the size of a juvenile, and she dropped the temperature of this clearing by 15 degrees in 8 seconds. She's been alive for 5 weeks, Walt said. The High Warden was still looking at Ember. "What will she be in 10 years? He said. It wasn't quite a question. "I don't know," Walt said. But I know what she's been for the past 5 weeks. She kept an old man's lungs working through mountain cold. She mapped a geological fracture before any instrument detected it. She stood in an open clearing in front of 6 soldiers and made her case without anyone telling her to. He paused. Whatever she becomes in 10 years, she's building it from that foundation. I think that a reasonable thing to trust. Soreth turned to the deputy warden. He said something in veil theory, low, precise, a single sentence. The deputy warden nodded once and stepped back, and the reclamation staff, which he had been holding in formal presentation position since he arrived, was lowered and then held at rest. The soldiers relaxed in unison. Dara stepped forward and reached into her traveling coat and produced a document, rolled, sealed with the Veil Theory Council's formal impression in amber wax, and held out toward Walt. I prepared this 3 days ago, she said, before I was certain it would be needed, before I was certain I would have the standing to present it. She glanced at Soreth. I have the standing now. Walt took the document. He unrolled it carefully and read it, moving his lips slightly the way he did when he was reading something that required precision. Marcus leaned in and read it over his shoulder. The document was written in both Veil Theory script and English, side by side, and invoked a clause of ancient Veil Theory bonding law. Older than a modern council, older than the treaty with humans, older than the reclassification of the Veil Thryn, that stated a confirmed Veil Thryn bond could not be dissolved by reclamation order, military action, or warden authority. The clause had never been formally repealed because no one had needed to invoke it in over 400 years. Dara had found it, had prepared the document, had been carrying it for 3 days. You were 60 years with him, Walt said, looking at her. You prepared this before you knew how it would go. I prepared it, Dara said carefully, because I believe the law was being misapplied. The law exists independent of who benefits from it. She paused. Your wife would have understood that distinction. Walt looked at her for a moment. Yes, he said, she would have. He rolled the document and held it at his side. He looked at Soreth, who had not moved, who was still standing in the center of the clearing with particular stillness, a very old creature processing the specific sensation of a future arriving differently than planned. There's still the mountain, Walt said. Yes, Soreth said. The drilling is stopped. The fracture propagation stabilizes without further intervention. Walt glanced at Marcus, who gave a single confirming nod. The winter nesting network survives. Your eggs survive. He paused. But the geothermal layer was access to begin with because the treaty boundary didn't give you authority to prevent it. That's a structural problem. It will happen again with a different company and a different drilling site, and you'll be back in the same position. Soreth looked at him steadily. You are proposing something. I'm proposing that your legal team and Marcus's company file a joint petition to the Treaty Council for a geothermal protection clause covering the neutral zone buffer. Walt said. Marcus has already drafted the framework. It doesn't require voiding the existing treaty. It's an amendment, narrow, specific, defensible under both legal systems. He looked at Soreth directly. You get what you actually needed. Without a war, without voiding 40 years of coexistence, that mostly works. The High Warden was quiet. You came to this mountain to say goodbye, Soreth said finally, and instead he paused. The pause was not uncertainty. It was the pause of a creature choosing its words with the care that 3 centuries had taught it. You rebuilt the load-bearing structure, he said, before it collapsed. Walt almost smiled. I was a structural engineer. I know what you were, Soreth said. Eleanor Greer's husband, a man who fixes things. He looked at Ember one final time. She looked back at him with those silver eyes, calm and present and entirely unintimidated, and something passed between them. Some acknowledgement that existed below the level of politics or law or fear in the older register where living things simply recognize each other for what they are. Then Soreth turned and walked back toward the ridge. The soldiers fell into formation behind him. The deputy warden followed. Reclamation staff, still at rest. The formal action concluded in the only way that left everyone with something to build on. At the tree line, Soreth stopped. He didn't turn around. The bond is recognized, he said. His voice carried across the clearing without effort, the way 3 centuries of authority carry a voice. Under old law, Let the record show it. Then he walked into the trees and was gone. Dara remained. She looked at Walt with the expression he'd first seen on that warning morning. The look of someone who had made a decision and was no longer negotiating with themselves. "The joint petition," she said. "I'll need a formal contact for the filing process." Marcus held out his card. "Call me," he said. "Anytime." Dara took the card and looked at it, and then looked at Marcus with the careful assessment of someone recalibrating an assumption. "You shut down the drilling operation before you knew how this would resolve," she said. "Yes," Marcus said. "Why?" Marcus was quiet for a moment. He looked at his father, who was watching Ember, who had walked back to the porch steps and was sitting on the bottom one in the morning light with her silver eyes on the ridge where Soreth had gone, patient and present and already, clearly, thinking about whatever came next. "Because it was the right thing to do," Marcus said. "And I had time." Dara looked at him. Then she looked at Walt. Then she made that sound again, not quite a word, not quite a laugh, but warmer than before. She walked back into the trees without another word, and the clearing was quiet, and the mountain was quiet, and Walt sat down on the porch steps beside Ember and put his hand on top of her head and felt her warmth moving through his palm and up his arm and into the old cold places in his chest, steady and precise and exactly right. Marcus sat down on the other side. Nobody said anything for a while. They just sat there in the morning light, the three of them, and let the mountain be quiet around them. 6 weeks later, Walt's handwriting had gotten smaller. He noticed it the way he noticed most things about his own decline, without drama, with the same practical attention he'd given to failing infrastructure over 30 years of engineering work. The letters were tighter now, less certain their spacing, like they were conserving energy. He'd been keeping a journal since the morning after the clearing, writing in one of Eleanor's unused notebooks he'd found at the back of the cabin shelf. He wasn't sure why exactly. He'd never been a journal writer. He thought maybe he just wanted there to be a record, in his own words, in case anyone needed to understand how it had happened. He wrote about the egg, about the cold on the ridge at 2 a.m, about Ember emerging piece by piece in the shell like she understood that the world required effort and intended to meet it properly. He wrote about Dara and Soreth and the clearing, and the way the temperature had dropped 15 degrees in 8 seconds and the soldiers had gone still. He wrote about Marcus shutting down the drilling operation with 9 words and a phone call. He wrote about Eleanor, not about losing her, about having her. The 41 years of it, the garden, the field journals, the cabin, the way she made coffee too strong, and was always right about it anyway. He wrote, "She was closer to the answer than she knew. She usually was. I should have read her notes sooner. I should have read everything sooner. That's the thing about time. You don't know what you had until you're using the last of it carefully." Ember slept at the foot of his bed and kept the room at exactly the right temperature, and Walt wrote in Eleanor's notebook until his handwriting got too small to continue. And then he slept, and in the morning Ember was awake watching the mountain through the window with those silver eyes, patient and permanent, already scanning whatever the day was going to require of her. Marcus came on a Friday. He didn't call ahead. He just drove up the mountain with groceries and a thermos of coffee and sat down at the kitchen table like a man who had decided that the distance between himself and something important had been maintained long enough. He looked older than he had 6 weeks ago, but differently older, not worn down, worn in, like something had settled into its proper place, and the settling had changed the shape of his face slightly. They talked for 3 hours, not about the treaty amendment, which was progressing through the joint filing process with Dara coordinating the veil theory side and Marcus's legal team handling the human side, not about the drilling site, which remained shut down. They talked about Eleanor, about the cabin, about a summer when Marcus was 9 and Walt had taught him to read a topographical map on this very porch, and Marcus had insisted he understood, and then led them both confidently in the wrong direction for 45 minutes before admitting he'd been reading the contour lines backward. Walt laughed, actually laughed the full version, which used more lung than he currently had available and produced a coughing fit that took a minute to resolve. And when it resolved, Marcus was sitting very still with his coffee cup held in both hands and his jaw tight. "Dad," he said. "I know," Walt said. "The Bozeman facility." "Marcus, it's a good facility. Mom would have." "Your mother," Walt said, with the gentle precision of someone who had thought about this carefully, would have been sitting exactly where you're sitting, making exactly the same argument, and she would have been wrong about it for exactly the same reasons. He paused to breathe. I'm not going to Bozeman. I'm going to stay on this mountain for as long as I can stay on this mountain. And then I'm not going to be anywhere, and that's all right. Marcus looked at him for a long time. His jaw worked once. Then he set down his coffee cup and looked out the window at Ember, who was on the porch in the afternoon light, watching the northern ridge with her steady silver focus. She'll be alone, Marcus said quietly. When you? No, Walt said. She won't. Marcus looked at him. Dara has already filed the secondary documentation. Walt said, under the old bonding law, when a Veil-Thrin's bonded partner dies, the bond doesn't dissolve. It transfers custodial recognition to the partner's nearest living family member. He paused. You're going to need to learn some Veil Theory legal terminology. Dara says she'll help. Marcus stared at him. You planned this. I'm a structural engineer. Walt said, I plan for load transfer. Something crossed Marcus's face. Grief and love and the specific helpless exasperation of a man who has spent his whole life being outmaneuvered by his father and has finally, at 44, made his peace with it. He put his face in his hands for a moment. His shoulders moved once. Walt let him have it. After a moment, Marcus lifted his head and looked at the window again. Ember had turned from a ridge and was looking through the glass at Marcus with those silver eyes, direct and calm, with the expression that Marcus had once described as unsettling patience and now understood differently. She wasn't being patient with him. She was simply already certain about him, had been certain since the morning he'd read the wrong thing in a wooden porch and she'd shown him how to fix it. She had never been uncertain about Marcus. That was the thing. She'd just been waiting for him to catch up. Dara came on a Wednesday, officially this time, with a formal Veil Theory courier and a document sealed with a full Northern Range Authority impression. Not amber wax, the permanent seal, the kind used for records that were meant to outlast the people who created them. She set it on the kitchen table, and Walt read it carefully, moving his lips slightly, taking his time. The document recognized the Walt-Ember bond under ancient Veil Theory law. It granted the cabin and the surrounding 12 acres protected status in perpetuity under both human and Veil Theory legal frameworks, neutral ground in the truest sense, belonging to neither side exclusively and therefore protected by both. It included a formal Veil Theory acknowledgement of the Veil-Thrin classification, reversing 200 years of council suppression. In the margin of the English translation, in small, precise handwriting that was not the courier's, Dara had written a single line. The minority opinion from the original reclassification vote has been entered into the active record. Your wife's translation was correct. Walt read that line twice. He folded the document carefully. He set on top of Eleanor's field journal, the old one, the one with the faded ribbon bookmark still marking the Veil-Thrin entry. The two things sat together on the kitchen table, and Walt looked at them for a moment. The old research and the new recognition, 19 years apart and finally in the same place. She would have loved this, he said. Nobody asked who he meant. Dara, standing across the table, simply inclined her head. Marcus, in the doorway, looked at the floor and breathed carefully. Ember on the windowsill looked at Walt. The weeks after that were quiet in the way that the best things are quiet. Not empty, but full of the specific peace that comes when the urgent things have been resolved, and what remains is simply the living of whatever time is left. Walt's mornings got shorter, and his afternoons got longer, and he spent them on the porch in Eleanor's old chair with his coffee, and his journal, and Ember beside him, both of them watching the mountain go through its daily changes the way people watch things they love and know they will miss. He taught her things. He wasn't sure how much he understood in the formal sense, but he talked to her the way he'd talked to Eleanor. Like the conversation mattered regardless of what came back. He told her about load-bearing structures and how to read a topographical map and why contour lines matter and how you can tell where a slope is going to fail before it fails if you know what to look for. He told her about the time he and Eleanor had gotten lost on this exact mountain because he'd been reading the contour lines backward and Eleanor had known it for 20 minutes before she said anything, letting him work out himself. Ember listened with her silver eyes half closed in the afternoon light. Her tail curled around the base of Eleanor's chair, the warmth she generated keeping the porch at exactly the right temperature while the autumn came in off the northern ridge and the mountain began its slow preparation for winter. On a morning in late October, Walt didn't come out to the porch. Marcus drove up that afternoon. He'd been driving up most weekends since September without being asked, without making a production of it. He'd stopped explaining why. He just came. He let himself in and found his father asleep in the bedroom chair, not in bed, in the chair by the window, the position Walt had taken preferring, because from it he could see the northern ridge and the tree line where Dara had first appeared and a particular stretch of trail that led up toward the ridge where the egg had been. He was peaceful. That was the thing Marcus held on to afterward, in the months that followed, in the moments when he needed something to hold. His father's face, in that last sleep, was the face of a man who had finished something and knew it and was satisfied with the work. Ember was on the windowsill. She was awake, silver eyes on the ridge, the way she always was in the mornings. The room was exactly the right temperature. It had been exactly the right temperature all night. Marcus stood in the doorway for a long time. Then he went and sat in the other chair, the one Eleanor used to read in, and he stayed there until the light changed. He called Dara that evening. She arrived the next morning, not officially, just herself, and she sat with Marcus on the porch, and they drank coffee and watched Ember watch the mountain and didn't say much because there wasn't much that needed saying. After a while, Dara said, "The treaty amendment passed a joint council review. Final ratification is next month." Marcus nodded. "He knew it would," Dara said. "Yes," Marcus said. "He did." Ember shifted on the porch railing. She turned from a northern ridge and looked at Marcus with those silver eyes, steady and direct, with the absolute certainty of something that had made his assessment and would not be revising it. She had looked at Walt that way every day for 5 weeks. Now she looked at Marcus that way, and it meant exactly what it had always meant. "You're mine. I've decided. Keep up." Marcus looked back at her. He thought about a porch board and a 9-year-old and a topographical map read backward. He thought about 9 words in a phone call. He thought about his father in Eleanor's reading chair, sleeping in the right temperature room, on a mountain that would now be protected for longer than any of them would be alive to see it. He thought. He never asked to matter. He just refused to leave. "All right," Marcus said to Ember, in the same quiet tone Walt had used on a dark ridge 5 weeks before she was born. "All right, then." Ember held his gaze for a moment. Then she turned back to the mountain, silver eyes scanning the northern ridge, patient and permanent, and already watching whatever came next. The mountain didn't care that Walter Greer was gone. It just sat there, the way it always had, indifferent and enormous and full of the things he'd left inside it. A protected clearing, a ratified amendment, a dragon who kept the temperature exactly right, and a son who had finally learned to read the contour lines correctly. The mountain didn't care, but it remembered.